All right, welcome everybody. If you can hear the sound of my voice, hand raise would, make me feel better. Thank you. Very good. All right. I just wanted to remind everybody that tomorrow, I think at 1 o'clock, we're having a special presentation about the different kinds of loans that you can get, commercial loans, which would include 5-unit properties and above, including the ability to do 90% financing. It would be a good thing to participate in. I'm just saying, I'll probably send you another invite if you haven't already signed up. Right? Just saying that. It's taken me a few minutes. I've been trying to figure out how to turn my cat filter on, but anyhow, I'm having difficulty with that. So today, we're going to talk about a fun subject. And this is going to be sort of a series that I'm going to go through called Forms That You Need to Know. And we're going to talk about the difference between an addendum and an amendment, and when to use one and when to use the other, and actually look at a couple of them that are a bit more complicated. And I've been seeing some issues involving it. And so I thought I would reach out to you and show you, what to do with them. So to begin with, the wording of addendum and amendment kind of gives away what they are about, because the beginning of the word addendum is add. And so an addendum is something that adds something to an existing document. And by adding it to the existing document, it becomes part of the original document. It is a sort of an explanatory note, citing certain requirements that were not specified in the original document. And then when the addendum is accepted by both the buyer and the seller, it becomes part of the binding agreement. An example might be, your buyer is submitting an offer on the home with the expectation of operating a home-based business. By the way, I see this oftentimes when people are buying condos and townhomes, homeowner associations, because, well, sometimes they have rules about that. And then sometimes there is zoning rules that regulate what kind of a business you can operate and under what circumstances out of a given property. Now, that isn't necessarily something that is quite as easy to find out sometimes, right, if you don't know where to look. So let's say, and by the way, that is not a normal contingency, right? If you go through all the list of contingencies, the ability to run a home-based business is not on the list. So what you might do if you were the buyer's agent is write an addendum that says that the purchase of the property is contingent upon verification that the buyers can operate a business in their home. And then typically we would tie that contingency to 14B, which is the part of the contingencies where it says you have so many days to remove them, right? You could just type that in the addendum. So then that would be attached, added to the original offer, and then when accepted, it would become part of the agreed terms. Now, there's a lot of addendums, and by the way, this isn't all of them. I know it's kind of hard to read, but I didn't want to go on for slide after slide after slide. If you wanted to look at them all yourself because you're the curious type, what you can do is in Zip Forms is go to search and type in the word addendum, and you're going to see, all of these, right? And there's actually multiple addendums for the basic one. There's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Additional signature addendum is a pain. I'm just saying, this is what happens. And for some reason, I've gotten this way too often in my life, where there are 3 or 4 buyers, right? That, by the way, that whole process is pretty much a class on its own, because the additional signatures addendum is what you would use when you have more than 2 signatures. And it's complicated, let me just say, right? Because what about the disclosures? What about all the other forms, And some agents just try to cram everything in. I'm going to do a session on that, on what do you do if you have more than 2 buyers. There's a bunch of them, an agricultural addendum, a backup offer addendum, the early occupancy addendums. There's, as you can see, quite a few of them, right? We're going to talk maybe about a couple of the more interesting ones today, maybe. and then maybe we'll work in some of these others as we go along. Now, the word amendment contains the word mend, right? And so to mend something is to fix something. To amend something means to modify something. So whereas an addendum adds something to a contract, an amendment mends or changes something that's in the existing document. So it would be supplemental, other information that's not spelled out or maybe is even incorrect. Now, both addendums and amendments can alter the content or terms of a purchase agreement, but it's a matter of when you're doing that that dictates which is used. So let me explain what that means. When you're writing an offer, typically is when you would use an addendum because you're adding something to your offer, you're adding something to the contract. So if there was a counter offer, you would be using an addendum because you would be adding something to the counter offer and therefore when accepted, making it part of a contract. Once the buyer and seller have both signed the purchase agreement, and now you're going to change something that's already in it, now you need an amendment. So a good example is the buyer makes an offer to purchase property contingent upon it appraising, right? Let's say the purchase price is $950. The appraisal comes in for $930, $925, not $950. Now, at that point, the buyer would have a right to cancel the agreement because the contingency was not met. The buyer also has the right to waive the contingency and say, I'll buy it anyhow. But it also gives the buyer the opportunity to essentially renegotiate a little bit. And so the buyer starts off by saying, well, I want you to lower your price to $930. And then the seller says, you're crazy, I'm not going that low. And they end up with $940 or something like that. They come up with a middle ground. At that point, what we've done is change the price in the purchase agreement. And to change the price in the purchase agreement, that would be an amendment. All right. So the California Association of Realtors, notice this is a much shorter list, has a, and by the way, it's not all inclusive because if you keep looking at all the documents, which I know you guys do, right? You know, when you have a few minutes of free time, you go through and read every one of the forms, right? I'm sure that's what you do. When you have insomnia, you know, that sort of thing. And you're going to see that the word amendment is stuck in some of them, but not in the title. These are just the ones that I found because I was lazy that are actually in the title. The amendment of existing agreement terms, right? The buyer amendment to escrow instructions. The coronavirus addendum or amendment, right? That one has both. Again, it depends on what point in the transaction. So that seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Right? Does anybody have trouble with what we've said so far? Right? Easy peasy, right? Would everybody agree? Right? Pretty easy. Great. Since nobody is saying, you know, not easy, let's see. Yeah, easy. Okay, great. I'm glad we have some people here. So let's do a quiz. Let's try this. All right. So here is a poll. And the first one says, the buyer's agent wants to credit the buyer part of their commission. What should they do? Would that be included in the RPA, page 2, other terms, right? Is that where you would put it? Where would be the best practices? Would that be an amendment or would that be an addendum? Anybody? Now, you get the vote, right? Everybody, you get the vote. And as I see, the majority are saying we're going to put it in the RPA under other terms. And there's a group of people, boy, people are changing their votes back and forth all over the place. The numbers are jumping more, an addendum to the RPA. So the best answer for this, and of course, the best answer for this is you, rather than putting it under existing terms, what you should do if you're the buyer's agent, when you're writing the offer, right? When you're writing the offer, you should make that an addendum to your offer, right? That would be the best practice. If we're already in contract and you want to do it, that makes it a little more difficult, and partly because paragraph 10 of the residential purchase agreement, where it talks about who the agents are, has a great big box, right? It has a great big box. And the first words in that box are that the agents, the real estate broker is not a party to this agreement. So we want that really to be put to the side, right? And of course, your office may have a different opinion than me, but they're probably wrong. Maybe, right? There's different opinions. But I would, instead of writing it in other terms, right, instead of doing that, because it's not so much a term of the contract, you would make it an addendum and add it to the purchase agreement. But that one, you know, it could vary, right? That could vary. Since you guys like that one, let's try this one. Sometimes it's hard for me to read. The spelling of the seller's name in the purchase agreement is wrong. What should be done? Would you make an addendum to correct the name, or would you make an amendment to correct the name? And we started off with an 80-20 split, and now we're down to about 60-40. Some people aren't using the poll, but just voting. That's okay. That's all right. You know, we're a bunch of free spirits here. 70% said make an amendment to the corrected name, and that is the correct answer. You win a prize. You all get a cigar for getting that right. And that's because if we realize that the purchase agreement is wrong, right? Now, by the way, if we were countering, like let's say the buyer made the offer, we were countering the offer, then I would use an addendum to change it or write that in the counter. But if it's already a signed agreement, we would use an amendment. That was too easy for you guys. So how about this one? The buyer wants credit from the seller for repairs, right? The seller didn't provide all the inspections. So the buyer has gotten all the inspections and they find a bunch of stuff wrong with the property and they want credit. Is it an amendment or an addendum? We were 50-50 for a while there. Now we're 50-50, 40-40. So if you're asking for a credit from the seller and the contract is already in place, that would be an amendment, right? We're amending the contract. If we were doing it again, the difference between addendums and amendments are addendums are used at the beginning when we're negotiating the transaction, and amendments are used later on after we've already signed all the documents. So we would amend it if we were asking for a credit. Okay, how about, what do you do if you find out that escrow is not going to close on time? What should you do? Ignore it, right? Because, you know, the loan agent said they were getting it together and it'll just be a few days. Make an addendum or make an amendment. Well, now, wow, the people that vote quickly generally are so we could use we would want to amend it if it says close of escrow is going to be on a certain day and we're changing the close of escrow. That would typically be something that we would like to amend. How about this one? Now these next two are a little tricky, but you guys are pretty swift, so we'll see. The seller wants to sell property with a contingency that they find a replacement property. Is that an amendment or an addendum? And we have 100% of the people who have voted for so far say it's an addendum. All right. Now, I'm going to pull up something for you guys just for fun. Sellers purchase of replacement property this is an addendum to the purchase agreement. So it would be an addendum if you were including it in the purchase agreement. However, potentially, if you're going to do it, that's when it's supposed to be. So those of you that picked an addendum, good show, good show. All right, let's see. Do we have any more? Isn't this fun? How about the buyer? The buyer wants to condition the property. Let me do that differently here. The buyer wants, I guess it doesn't really matter. The buyer wants to condition the purchase of the property on them being able to sell their property. Here, I probably should push this button first. How about that? So the buyer says, I'm willing to buy your property, but only if I can sell your property. What is that typically? An amendment or an addendum? And boy, well, you guys are getting good at this. Again, the issue is if you're doing it at the time that you're writing the offer, it's an addendum. If you're doing it later, we typically call it an amendment, right? But it's an addendum at this point. And how many more of these do I have? Only 18 more. How about that? So what happens if you find out that the broker's DRE number is wrong? It's incorrect. And you need to fix it, right? Because the agent, you know, I don't know where they looked it up someplace. They got it wrong. So typically this would be a buyer is making an offer, but the DRE number is wrong. Most people are saying it's an amendment, so I have to go along with you. It would be an amendment. And I'm going to actually show you the right form to use for that. How about this one? So the buyer has made an offer, and the offer says it has a very tight leash. So it says that you have to accept our offer within, 8 hours or something like that. And you're going back and forth with the seller, and you've decided you want to counter the buyer's offer. But it doesn't look like you're going to be able to counter the buyer's offer in the time period that the buyer has given you for acceptance. So is this a problem? Right? What should you do? Nothing, because a counter offer is a new offer. So who cares if you miss the time period? Would you have an addendum to extend the offer expiration date or an amendment? And most people are getting this right. It would be an addendum, right? So what we would do, the buyer has made us an offer. We're countering the offer, but we're doing so not within the time period that the buyer gave us in paragraph 31. Now, the reason that we have to do this is because on page 10 of the residential purchase agreement up at the top, where there's a place for the seller to sign, right? There's a box, which by the way, you need to check if you're doing this, that says that you are accepting the offer subject to the attached counteroffer. Now, if that offer has already expired without an extension, right, expired, then you can't accept it subject to an attached counteroffer. So you would have an addendum that says that the time period for accepting that offer would be extended. All right. Is that all? I know you're wishing there were more, but that's what I got right now. So let's take a look at some of these forms, right? Because I mean, I know you guys are, you're all up on this, right? I know you are. So I've seen this a couple of times recently, and where, which is sort of weird, right? And I'll do it in the way that it makes sense. So it's a hot market, right? Sellers get to call the tune, right? Buyers have to dance if the seller says dance. Isn't that the kind of market that we're in? So we've had an instant where the seller is saying, buyer makes an offer, and then the seller counters the offer. The seller doesn't use this form, which is the listing agent doesn't use this form, which is a mistake, right? Doesn't use this form, but writes in the counteroffer that this is contingent upon the seller finding a replacement property, because the seller doesn't want to sell their house unless they know they can buy a house. Now, you understand this could be an issue. In a way, this is a marketing tip, which I generally only give to the people that I'm coaching or mentoring, but it's a lot easier to sell a vacant home or a non-owner occupied property today than an owner occupied property. And the reason it's sometimes hard to sell owner occupied property is because the owner occupant needs to go buy another house. And although they may be getting multiple offers on their property, they realize that once they've sold their property, they're going to be in line making multiple offers on somebody else's property, and they may not get it. Does everybody understand? Now, because the seller doesn't want there to be any problems, they don't want to be homeless, right? They don't want to be homeless. So they wanted to sell the property contingent on them being able to find a replacement property. Now, notice this is an addendum to the purchase agreement, right? It's an addendum. So and I just want to cover this, and then I'll cover the next one, and then I'll explain why this is not a great idea, and maybe for no additional charge, explain what your options would be if you were the listing agent, because I've been in this situation. So this would be, most of this is pretty straightforward. Finding the replacement property. The agreement is contingent on seller entering into a contract to acquire replacement property. Seller shall within 17 or, now in this case, the agent was asking for 60 days because they realize it's a seller's market and their seller is about to become a buyer. So many days after acceptance, remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel this agreement. So they're given a short period of time or whatever you want to write in. If seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time, buyer, after first giving notice to seller to perform, which requires 2 days, and if it falls on 2 calendar days, but if it falls on a holiday or a weekend, it rolls over to the next business day, they can cancel it in writing. Now, this can be a hard sell, right? You understand? So what the seller has done by putting in that contingency is they've reduced the number of buyers that are actually going to be interested in buying their property, right? You understand? You may not have 20 offers with that contingency because all the buyers are thinking, well, wow, you know, even if we're in contract, then we don't know if we're really buying this house or any other property. We don't know what we're doing. By the way, those of you that are following along so far, when would the buyer make their earnest money deposit? Well, that's one of the issues, right? The problem with the agent just typing that in a counter offer is they didn't confront, what about the deposit, right? Because if you just use the RPA and you don't mess with the timelines, it says that the buyer's deposit has to go into escrow within 3 days. 3 business days from acceptance. Is that true here? It depends, right? Now, if the seller has already entered into a contract to find the replacement property and it's in escrow, that's a lot easier to sell, right? Because we're already in escrow and therefore, you know, it looks like it's going to close. Of course, the seller didn't even want to start looking in this case. I didn't even want to start looking until they knew they had somebody that wanted to buy their house. So remember, the seller's motivation is, I don't want to end up homeless and I don't want to sell my house and not have any place to live. So I'm not even going to start seriously looking. Certainly, I'm not going to go into escrow until I know that somebody wants to buy my house with this contingency. Or C, if checked, the agreement is already, we're way beyond the contract. It's contingent on the seller's ability to close the replacement property. We're moving further ahead, right? So we're not, it's pretty close to B, but not exactly the same, right? So then it talks about time periods. So what about inspections, right? In this case, the seller didn't do any inspections because the seller doesn't know if anybody's going to buy their property with this contingency. So why do inspections, right? And so the buyer has to do all their own inspections. So when does that begin? Now, if you're the buyer on this property, and let's say they had 60 days to find the replacement property, do you want to put your deposit into escrow, knowing that if they don't find a property in 60 days, they just cancel the contract and you start all over? Do you want to pay $1,400, $1,600 to have all the brace of inspections done when this, just to have the seller say, oh, well, you know, I didn't find a replacement property, so the deal's off? Probably not. So what are the options? And the reason that it's good to use the form, real estate agents, I call it poetry, right? And what I mean by poetry is real estate agents like to just type up stuff, right? Poetry, right? I've actually seen some where they rhymed, you know. There is an issue with you just writing up stuff, right? Have you been to law school? Right? Have you been to law school? Did you pass the bar exam? It's a lot better to use the California Association of Realtors forms whenever you can, because they were actually written by lawyers. As I mentioned before, many real estate agents learn real estate out on the street, you know, and just because somebody else did it, you say, well, that sounds pretty good. So they just typed it up. But look at the time periods. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from the date of acceptance shall begin the day after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency as specified in paragraph 1A. That's the default setting. Now, you understand what the agent wrote up, which is the contract is contingent upon the seller finding a replacement property within 60 days, doesn't answer the question, what about the deposit? What about time periods for inspections? What about all that, right? It doesn't answer the question, right? And those are good questions. Now, you could check the box remain as specified in the agreement, but you understand that's putting all of the risk on the buyer. Most of these addendums and agreements and advisories are all about distribution of risk. And the seller doesn't want to have any risk and the buyer doesn't want to have any risk. So maybe we could share it somehow. I'll talk more about that. If close of escrow is identified as a specific date in the agreement, it should remain on that date. So in other words, if when you're filling out the residential purchase agreement and it says close of escrow and you put in a date, then that's the date. But if you put in within 30 days, as an example, then that time period for within 30 days would not be running from the date of acceptance of the contract. But according to this addendum, the 30 days would begin to run from the date that the seller has removed the finding replacement property contingency. What about the deposit? Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within 3 days after seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing that contingency. Or you could check the box, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. As it says in the agreement, which would be in 3 days. The buyer doesn't want to put their money in escrow if the seller has 60 days to back out. The buyer doesn't want to pay for inspections and reports and do all that and have that whole 17-day contingency come and go just to find out then that the seller has decided not to sell. Close of escrow, buyer and seller agree that seller may extend close of escrow date from the sale of seller's property for a maximum of. Right? Because sometimes getting in contract and all of that, they may need more than 30 days. You could write in an additional 15 days, an additional 10 days or 20 days, you could write in a date. But usually, normally, those of you that have heard me talking about this, it's normally better where it says the close of escrow to put in a specific date, right? A specific date. This is an exception to it, because we don't really know when the whole contract is really going to kick in until the seller has removed that contingency. Other terms, just because there's a blank spot doesn't mean you should write stuff in, right? Most of the time when I see agents writing stuff in, it's, you know, not really necessary. And sometimes, you know, agents write in all sorts of weird stuff. Like one of the things that bothers me a little bit, right? You know, when my medication is kicked in, not as much. Agents like in that counter offer would type in properties being sold as is, where is, right? Why would an agent write that in? because somebody told them to at some point. That's gibberish, and it's also unnecessary. The residential purchase agreement already says that the property is being sold as is in its present condition, subject to buyer's inspection rights. You don't want to write things that are already in the contract, right? And make those and restate the terms. And the reason you don't want to do that is because if this ever were to go to an arbitration or a court and you are being deposed by an attorney, the attorney would be saying, so you've changed the contractual as is clause, right? And you're like, what do you mean? Well, you wrote in as is, where is, which means obviously you're modifying the words that were put in the purchase agreement. Wasn't that your intention? Wasn't that your intention to change the words that the California Association of Realtors lawyers wrote, right? And to replace them with your words? Wasn't that your intention? And if you say, well, no, I didn't really mean to do that, well, then why did you write it in if it's already in the contract? The only plausible reason you wrote it in when it was already in the contract is because you wanted to change what was in the contract, right? So why don't you explain to us now, what do you mean by that, right? You're in trouble, right? You're in trouble because I'll bet you can't explain why you did it, other than, well, somebody told me that that's always a good thing to write in, right? So just don't write in stuff just because some agent told you it was a good idea. Even after the expiration of the time for, this is the final thing here, even after the expiration of the time for finding the replacement property contingency specified in 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels pursuant to paragraph 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal, buyer may not cancel pursuant to paragraph 1A. So one of the things I pointed out to the agent that I was working with is the buyer needs to understand that there is nothing in this contract, this addendum, that says the buyer has the right to change their mind and not buy the property. Now, if they haven't put their deposit in, and this is why sometimes when agents are doing this, they would want this box checked. So the buyer puts their deposit in, because that way the buyer could lose the deposit if they just decided to back out because they found another house, right? But if there's no deposit, there's really nothing that the seller can do to you, because liquidated damages assume that there is liquid, which means money in the escrow that you could forfeit as damages. All right. So if this is a 60-day to find a replacement property and your buyer accepts the offer and the buyer has put their deposit into escrow, there's nothing here that says they can just change their mind and buy another house. Right? It doesn't say that. Right? Just saying. Now, there's another problem with this, right? Which my experience tells me that anybody that's doing this is also doing something else. And that something else involves the purchase of their replacement property. And I don't have a poll for this, but there's another document that always just about they want to use. If the seller wants to say, I ain't selling unless I find a replacement property, there's another issue that they always, just about always in my experience, want on the purchase. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, they want to make the purchase contingent on the sale of that property. In other words, the seller doesn't want any risk. So the seller is saying, I don't want to sell my house unless I find a replacement property. And then the seller is saying, I don't want to buy this other house unless I can close on the one that I have on my own sale. And now, first of all, let me just explain what this form means. And one of the things I said, these are like the two worst contingencies, right? In terms of trying to get the best money, and I'll explain why in a moment, and what you could do about it, right? Besides using these forms. So so now I found somebody that's desperate, right? And they're saying, look, we don't care how long it takes. We want to buy your house. You can have 60 days. We'll give you an extension. We'll do whatever it takes, right? So I found somebody who's willing to sign that replacement form. Now I'm going to Santa Rosa or wherever I'm planning to move to. And now I'm really seriously looking for homes to buy. So I find a property in Santa Rosa where, by the way, the market is also kind of tight. And now I want to make that purchase contingent on me selling that other property. Will that ever work? And the answer is yes, but only when you're looking for a replacement property. You look for properties that have been on the market for over 100 days. So if you find a property that's been on the market 150, 200 days, they'll take just about anything, right? And they'll take just about anything. But if this is a fresh property that's just hit the market in Santa Rosa and they're doing the calendar program where every 15 minutes they're showing the property, there's a buyer that I've been sort of working with, referral through to somebody from EXP over in the Stockton Elk Grove area. And in the first 2 days, the property had been shown 70 times. Now, you understand, if that seller who's a buyer wants to buy a property that's been shown 70 times in 2 days, and they have this contingency, there's absolutely no way they're going to get it, right? Because the seller's got choices, right? And this is not a good choice. So the buyer can only look for properties that have been languishing on the market because they're overpriced and that sort of thing. So what does this form say? Right, and the buyer, this agreement is contingent upon buyer entering into the contract for the sale of and closing on buyer's property. If that's all you've checked, this isn't so good, right? Because as you're going to see, we want to know, is it on the market already? Only entering into a contract for the sale of the property. Notice the difference between A and B. A says that it's contingent upon closing the other property. B says it's simply contingent upon getting in the contract. Of course, anybody that wants these contingencies is too nervous to say just getting in the contract, because what if it doesn't close? Or only the close of escrow on the buyer's property. Buyer's property is already in escrow with, and there's a number. Now, this is better. If you're already in contract and you have an escrow number with an estimated date of closing and preferably a net sheet, this becomes a little easier to sell. A copy of the contract for the sale of buyer's property and the contact information escrow number is evidence is attached to the COP form. That's what this is called, or will be delivered within 2 days. So if you're already in contract and your contingencies have been removed and you're about to close and you've got a closing statement that shows you're going to have enough cash, that, by the way, can be used as proof of funds, right? When we're writing, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So that's one way. Buyer entering into the contract for sale of the buyer's property, if 1A or 1B applies, buyer shall have 17 days to enter into a contract. So if we're making our purchase contingent upon our sale, they're usually not going to give you forever to sell your property. The default here is 17 days. By the earlier the time period in 2A, or within 2, buyer shall deliver escrow evidence to seller and escrow holder. So not only do you have 17 days to get into contract, you're going to have to prove that you're even in contract. And then it asks some kind of important questions. Is your property already on the market? If the answer is no, this becomes an even worse contingency. You're saying, well, I'm willing to buy your house, but only if I can sell my house. Have you put it on the market? No. Right? First they say, are you in contract already? No, no. Is it on the MLS? No, no, not yet. Well, why not? Well, because, we don't want to sell it until we find something to buy. Oh, all right. So that's not That's not good if it isn't already a signed listing agreement and in the multiple listing service. Buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS. Property, you don't want to check the box the buyer is not unless you're double ending it and you already have a buyer. Buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and applicable the MLS listing within 1 day of acceptance if buyer's property is already listed with the real estate brokerage, or if not already listed within 1 day after listing. So I'm going to summarize this a little bit. I mean, this one, I mean, this is a longer one, right? But basically what it's now going to say is it has to close, right? Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the buyer's property. They want to know about the status. You have to keep the seller informed if you've removed your contingencies or not. If your contract is canceled, you have to tell the seller. They're going to kick you out probably when they hear that. Cancellation of a buyer's property is in or enters escrow and either party to that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation. Buyer shall deliver to seller written notice of that cancellation, right? Which means if it falls through, you're not going to get anything. Now, the difference between this and the replacement property is that this allows for the seller on the replacement property to continue to offer it for sale and to take backup offers. And it has it's usually a 72 hours, I'll show it to you. We'll see. Backup offers after acceptance, seller has the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. The parties acknowledge the broker shall not violate MLS rules requiring active property status reporting. So what that means, the property in Santa Rosa, once they've accepted the offer, is supposed to change the status in Santa Rosa from active to contingent. And in many of the MLSs, they have what's called contingent with a release clause. And what a release clause would be, that's, well, speaking of B, removal buyer unless the seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of signed accepted backup offer within the time period 7C. Seller shall have the right to give written notice to buyer to, in writing, remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency if any, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then cancel the agreement in writing. What that means is that if that property in Santa Rosa gets an offer that's not contingent and they like it better, they can accept it. And then you've got 2 days to remove your sale of property contingency to prove that you're going to be able to close without it, which of course is probably difficult to do because that's why you're doing it. There's a delayed right to do this. Seller does not have the right to do this. This, by the way, is very hard to sell because basically it's saying we're going to tie your property up for all this period of time and you're not going to know whether or not we're actually selling our property or not. In a minute, I'm going to just explain, put this maybe in a better context and give you some suggestions as to how to avoid filling out this form. This contingency can only be removed in writing, even if buyer removes the contingency, unless buyer also performs all actions, seller has the right to cancel. So here is the seller cancellation right. They give the buyer notice to remove contingencies and provide proof of funds. If they don't do it, they can cancel. They give the buyer a notice to perform. They don't perform, they can cancel. And then the buyer has a right to cancel if they are unable to enter into contract within the time period specified. And then there's more about that, other obligations, and I don't know. I'm tired of talking about this form because this is the wrong way to do it. Now, what I explained to the agent was, this is not the way to do it. let's say you're the listing agent and the seller says, and I've had this happen, right? Where the seller says, I don't want to sell my property unless I can buy another property. Is it possible for me to do that? To make the sale of my property contingent upon me finding a replacement property? And at the listing appointment, by the way, I said, absolutely. Absolutely. We got a form for that, right? I just went over it. Great. And then they said, now we want to buy a property. This happened to be in Santa Rosa. And is it possible for us to buy the property in Santa Rosa? Is it possible for us to do that and making that purchase contingent upon our selling this property? And I said, yes, absolutely, you can do that too. We got a form for that as well. These are the forms. Now, none of that got written up actually in the listing agreement. I just listed the property. And then an offer comes in. Now, what I had told the seller is, now start looking at properties in Santa Rosa. Now start looking at properties, right? And just to make sure that there is some things there that you would be interested in buying and living in, just start now. Then we get an offer, right? And the offer is above the list price. The buyer is, this was a property in Santa Clara, just a couple of miles from the Apple campus. I mean, this was like, you know, it wasn't difficult. People wanted it. And that buyer was very cooperative. What do you want to do? We want to buy the property. And so then the seller said, well, are we making it contingent upon us finding the replacement property? And I said, you need to understand what that's going to do. If you make the sale of your property contingent upon you finding a replacement property, most of the good buyers are not going to be interested. And you're going to get less money from the sale of your property, right? You understand, even though there were multiple offers back in those days, that seller, that contingency, right? The one that says we have to find a replacement property, that knocks out most what I call retail buyers. And a retail buyer is somebody who's really interested in buying a house. It's all fixed up, and all they have to do is replace the stage furniture with their furniture and move right in. Those are the buyers that pay the highest price possible. They don't want to buy one of these unless if they can avoid it, right? Because if you buy one of those, there's no guarantee you're even going to ever buy the house, and they really want to buy the house. So if you sell your property with this contingency, you're going to sell your property for a lot less money than you would if you don't have that contingency. Now, when we turn around and we go to Santa Rosa and we're writing offers on properties, and I said, what would you do if you were selling your property and there were two offers and both of them were, let's say, $800,000? And one of them was contingent upon the sale of their other property, and the other one was not. Which offer would you take if you were the seller? And obviously, we would take the one without a contingency. So how much more would the contingent offer have to be before you would consider taking it? And the answer is a whole lot more. And by the way, for many sellers, it doesn't matter how much more. They don't want to take a property with that contingency. So what that means, if you do it that way, first of all, you're going to get less when you sell your property, and you're going to have to pay more when you buy the property. And the other thing is, you're not going to buy fresh property that's right on the market, because you'll be outbid for those. You can't compete with this contingency. So you can only really be looking at properties that have been on the market for a long time, right? So you don't get as good of a property. You're going to have to pay more for the property, and you're going to get less when you sell your property. How much, lumping all that together, would that cost the client to do it that way? 100,000? 150, maybe more? Would it be possible for the buyer, seller, buyer to rent for a while, putting their stuff in storage, and then buy something and come out ahead financially? I mean, you understand what I'm saying? The amount they're going to lose by doing this double contingency is huge, right? It's a huge amount. So what we did in that one, because the kind of property that she wanted was not the kind that everybody was bidding on, right? For a variety of reasons. So what we did is we waited until we sold the property in Santa Clara without a contingency to have a replacement property, right? Because I convinced her that this would work a lot better. And we got way above list price. I'm talking $110,000 above list price, right? And we listed it for 9 something and it sold for 1.1, right? We got a lot more than the list price. And once those and at that time, look in Santa Rosa, keep looking in Santa Rosa. When all the contingencies are removed, we then took the closing statement from the one in Santa Clara that, by the way, would show that there was going to be enough cash to pay cash on the one in Santa Rosa. And now in Santa Rosa, we're making an all cash offer without this buyer sale contingency. You think we got more money because we sold it without the replacement contingency? Say yes, please. And now that we're presenting all cash on the purchase, do you think we got a better deal when we were buying the property in Santa Rosa? The answer is yes, because we're all cash. And what did we use for proof of funds? We used the closing statement from the one that was about to close. So what else? This is, could you do a rent back in there? Or yeah, so rent back. Yes, in fact, what we did, by the way, this is also what I told them, right? We're going to give you, we could get up to 60 days as a rent back, right? We can get you up to 60 days. So you're going to have a buffer to go find your other property. See, the clients in Santa Clara didn't have enough money to go do anything. They couldn't move until this thing closed. So we also, because this, remember, Santa Clara, not far from Apple, you know, this wasn't a hard, I mean, the house was trash, but you know, Santa Clara, not far from Apple, right? A lot of people were interested in it. So could we talk them into up to 60 days free rent back? Absolutely, that wasn't an issue. People just wanted to buy the property. So that also gives them, one of the other things that I would always talk about in this discussion is delaying possession to buy a little bit more time. But what I sold them on was doing it the way I was suggesting, even if they didn't find a property within that 60-day period, and we were going to start sooner, they could put their stuff in storage and go to Santa Rosa, rent the best hotel suite they could find until they found another property and still come out ahead financially, right? Still come out ahead financially. Now, by the way, if you're one of the agents that I'm coaching or mentoring or working with in some way, and you have a client that wants to do this, and they're talking, can we do that or make this, you know, contingent and that contingent? Ask me, and I'd be willing to talk to them for you, right? Because I've gone through this enough times to know what the downside is, right? Anyhow, so I just wanted to pick those two out because it's come up again, and I know from our market right now that this is something that is in sellers' minds, right? If it's owner occupied, they're thinking, but if I sell, what if I can't find something to buy? And I don't want to buy if I can't sell. So what do I do? Somebody has to take a risk. The question is, would the seller take a little bit of a risk, right? Remember, they could rent and put stuff in storage. Would they be willing to take a risk for 100 grand, 150 grand? Right? You understand though that those differences between what they can sell for and what they're going to have to pay when they buy, that could be a huge difference financially to them. All right. I don't know if that made any sense at all. I don't know. But that's, I don't know if there's any questions about all of that right now, other than, you know. Huh? But, well, that's what I got for today. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the other fun forms. We're going to do that for a little while because there's some other forms that I see agents sometimes struggling with, and I think it would be a good idea to maybe talk about it, particularly if you work with me, because I would rather do it now rather than have to do it later when we're in a contract. But then a lot of these require some help when you're in it anyhow. So if there aren't any other questions, and I'm not seeing other questions at this moment, I'm going to say goodbye and come to the thing tomorrow about the loans. It should be very interesting, right? Should be a lot of fun. And by the way, if you would like somebody like me to help you with your transactions, if you'd like to have somebody that you could talk to on a Sunday evening because you've got problems and you need help, and you're not getting that from where you are now, reach out to me, talk to me. You don't have to live like that anymore. Let me just tell you. All right, that's it. Talk to you guys later. Have a great day. Stay safe out there, by the way.